There is a story that begins not with a battle, not with a cosmic catastrophe, not with the kind of dramatic rupture that announces itself as the start of something significant, but with 6 men sitting quietly in a room, deciding that the world needed to be protected from itself. It is a story about intelligence and its limits, about power and the particular blindness that power can produce in even the most careful and well-intentioned minds, about the long distance between a good decision and a good outcome, and about what happens when the most extraordinary people in the world decide, with complete sincerity and considerable evidence on their side, that the rest of the world is better off not knowing what they are doing on its behalf. Settle in now and let the mind grow quiet, and allow this story to carry you gently through the long, strange history of Marvel's most powerful secret, told at a pace that asks nothing of you but the willingness to listen. The story of the Illuminati does not begin with a meeting. It begins with a war that almost ended everything, fought so far above the ordinary surface of human awareness that most of the people whose lives depended on its outcome never knew it was happening at all. The Kree-Skrull War was not the first conflict between those two ancient and hostile civilizations. It was simply the first in which Earth found itself positioned, by accident of geography and the peculiar density of superhuman individuals concentrated on its surface, directly in the path of both sides simultaneously. For decades, the Kree and the Skrull had been engaged in a cold and grinding conflict that expressed itself in proxy engagements, territorial pressures, and the occasional eruption of direct violence across systems so remote from Earth that no human telescope had yet resolved them into anything more than points of light. But the war that arrived in the years of Earth's early superhero age was different in kind from what had come before, because it arrived here, because it used this world and its people as both battlefield and resource, and because it demonstrated with unmistakable clarity that Earth was no longer simply a small planet at the edge of a minor galaxy, isolated by distance from the great conflicts of the universe, but was instead precisely the kind of place that great conflicts would increasingly find their way to. The heroes who fought in that war did so with characteristic courage and considerable improvisation. The Avengers, the Fantastic Four, individual heroes operating in coordination with each other and with the Kree captain Mar-Vell, managed through effort and sacrifice and a quality of determined creativity that has always characterized Earth's defenders to bring the conflict to an end without the planetary devastation that had at various points seemed probable. They won, or something close enough to winning that the immediate crisis resolved. The Skrulls withdrew. The Kree presence reduced to something manageable. Earth survived. But Tony Stark, in the quiet that followed, found that he could not stop thinking about how close it had been. He was, in those years, already the person he would remain for the rest of his life in most of the ways that mattered. Brilliant, restless, inclined to approach every problem as an engineering challenge susceptible to the right combination of resources and intelligence, and possessed of a particular kind of anxiety that expressed itself not as paralysis but as compulsive preparation. He did not handle uncertainty by accepting it. He handled it by building systems designed to reduce it, and when those systems proved insufficient, he built better ones, and when those proved insufficient, he thought harder about the design. The Kree-Skrull War had revealed a gap in his design that he could not stop examining. The gap was simple to describe and enormously difficult to address. Earth's heroes had nearly lost a war they barely knew was coming, against enemies whose capabilities and intentions had been almost entirely unknown to them until the moment of engagement. The intelligence failure was not the result of negligence or incompetence. It was structural. No single individual or organization possessed anything close to a complete picture of the cosmic threat landscape. The Avengers knew what the Avengers knew. The Fantastic Four knew what Reed Richards had been able to observe and analyze. Doctor Strange's awareness extended into magical and dimensional domains that overlapped only partially with the geopolitical and military intelligence that other heroes carried. There was no mechanism for combining these separate bodies of knowledge into anything resembling a unified picture of what Earth was actually facing. What was needed, Tony had concluded, was not a larger organization or a more public alliance, but something smaller, quieter, and more carefully constructed. A group of individuals who together covered the full range of domains from which threats to Earth might emerge, who trusted each other enough to share what they knew without institutional barriers or political considerations, and who were willing to make decisions quickly and implement them without the delays that democratic deliberation inevitably imposed. Not a replacement for the existing hero community, but a complement to it. A brain trust, a small group of people who, between them, knew everything that needed to be known, and who could use that knowledge in the ways that the situation required. He began with Reed Richards, because Reed was the person whose intelligence most closely matched his own, though in a register so different that comparison felt approximate at best. Where Tony's genius was fundamentally architectural, oriented toward building and optimizing systems that operated in the physical world, Reed's genius was theoretical in a way that sometimes seemed to operate outside the physical world entirely, as though the mathematical structures he worked with were more real to him than the matter they described. They had been colleagues, in the loose sense that the word carries among people whose work occasionally intersects. For years, they respected each other with the particular quality of respect that exceptional people feel for the rare individuals who challenge, rather than simply confirm their own assessments. Reed listened to Tony's proposal with the careful, slightly distant attention that characterized his engagement with ideas he was taking seriously, and he said yes, though his yes carried reservations that he articulated precisely and that Tony acknowledged without fully resolving. Charles Xavier was the next conversation, and the most complicated because Xavier's situation was categorically different from that of every other person Tony approached. Reed Richards was a scientist, the most capable on Earth, but he was one man with a family and a laboratory. Tony Stark was a businessman and an engineer and a hero, powerful and influential, but his power was ultimately personal. Charles Xavier was the leader of a movement, the father figure and strategist, and sometimes the conscience of an entire people who had spent decades being persecuted for the accident of their genetics, and who had learned to survive in a world that feared them partly through the very practices of strategic secrecy and careful information management that Tony was now proposing to deploy on a cosmic scale. Xavier understood the value of hidden knowledge better than almost anyone alive. He also understood its cost better than almost anyone alive. He said yes. And his yes was quieter than Reed's and carried more weight. Namor the Submariner was, in some ways, the easiest conversation and the most uncomfortable. Easy because Namor had never been encumbered by the kind of idealism that made the proposal feel transgressive to people who believe deeply in transparency and democratic accountability. Uncomfortable because Namor's willingness to accept the proposal's premises said something about those premises that Tony preferred not to examine too closely. The King of Atlantis had been conducting the affairs of an entire civilization largely outside the awareness of the surface world for decades. Secrecy was not a moral compromise for Namor. It was the condition of his existence. He agreed to participate with the directness of someone who found the ethical deliberation surrounding the decision slightly tedious, and his agreement carried a pragmatic certainty that both reassured Tony and gave him something to think about on the flight home. Black Bolt presented unique challenges of a logistical rather than philosophical nature. The king of the Inhumans, whose voice carried the destructive force of a nuclear weapon, in a single, whispered word, had long since developed methods of communication that allowed him to participate in complex discussions without speaking. But those methods required patience and attentiveness from his interlocutors that not everyone was willing to provide. Tony was willing. He sat across from Black Bolt in the inhuman city of Attilan and had one of the strangest conversations of his life, conducted entirely in gesture and written exchange, and understood by its end that he was in the presence of a mind that processed the world with a clarity and a patience that made his own restlessness seem almost frivolous. Black Bolt agreed, and his agreement felt like a considered and irrevocable commitment in a way that the other's agreements, however sincere, had not quite achieved. Doctor Strange was the last conversation, and the one Tony had been most uncertain about, not because he doubted Strange's capabilities or his willingness to act in the world's defense, but because the Sorcerer Supreme operated according to a framework of values and responsibilities that Tony did not entirely understand and could not entirely evaluate. Magic, in Tony's conception of the world, was a domain that resisted the kind of systematic analysis he preferred, and Strange was its foremost practitioner and guardian, which meant that his perspective on the proposal would be shaped by considerations that Tony could acknowledge without fully grasping. Strange listened to the proposal with an attentiveness that felt evaluative rather than simply receptive, as though he was not merely taking in the information Tony was presenting, but measuring it against criteria that he had not shared and would not share until he had finished his assessment. The magical tradition to which Strange had dedicated his life had its own long history of secret knowledge, of information withheld from the unprepared for their own protection, of small groups of individuals who understood things that the broader world could not be trusted to receive without harm. In that sense, the Illuminati's proposal was familiar in its structure, if not in its specific application. Strange agreed, and his agreement came with a quality of deliberate acceptance that suggested he understood the weight of what he was committing to, in ways that perhaps exceeded even Tony's own understanding. They met for the first time as a complete group in a location that Tony had selected for its combination of security and symbolic neutrality, a space that belonged to none of them individually, and therefore implied no hierarchy of precedence, no suggestion that any member's domain or perspective was primary. It was a quiet room. It was furnished simply. The 6 of them sat around a table in the particular quality of silence that gathers when people of great intelligence and considerable mutual wariness occupy the same space without yet having established the rhythms of communication that make such gatherings feel natural rather than strained. Tony spoke first, because it was his meeting, and because silence in service of diplomacy was not among his more developed skills. He laid out the argument he had been refining since the end of the Kree-Skrull War, the structural intelligence failure, the preventable near catastrophe, the potential for something worse next time. The case for a small and secret coordinating body that could address the gap. He spoke for a long time, because the argument was complex, and because he had the particular quality of thoroughness that comes from someone who has rehearsed a presentation until every potential objection has been pre-addressed. When he finished, the room was quiet again for a moment that stretched just long enough to feel significant. Reed spoke next, and then Xavier, and then Namor, and then Strange, while Black Bolt's contributions arrived in the patient, gestural language that the others had already begun to develop the attentiveness to receive. The conversation that followed lasted for several hours. It ranged across the threat landscape they collectively perceived, across the philosophical questions that Tony's proposal raised, across the practical mechanics of how the group would function. It was not an easy conversation, because none of the people in the room had arrived at their respective positions by being easy, and because the questions they were discussing were genuinely difficult. But it was, from the beginning, a serious conversation conducted by serious people who shared a foundational commitment to the world they were trying to protect, even as they differed, sometimes substantially, in their understanding of how that protection should be pursued. By the time the meeting concluded and the 6 of them prepared to return to their separate lives and separate responsibilities, something had been established that had not existed before. Not a formal organisation with bylaws and membership cards and official standing, something quieter and more contingent than that. A commitment to meet again, to share what they knew, to think together about the threats they could collectively perceive, and to act on that thinking when action was required. A group that did not officially exist, composed of individuals who would not confirm its existence, operating in the silence between all the other stories that the world was telling about its heroes. They called themselves, in the rare moments when they referred to themselves at all, the Illuminati. The name was partly ironic and partly serious, in the way that names chosen by people who are too intelligent to be entirely comfortable with their own grandiosity often carry both registers simultaneously. They knew what the word implied. They had accepted in choosing it. What those implications said about their understanding of their own role. They were the people who knew. They had decided collectively that this was what they were, and that this was what they needed to be. The decision felt in that first meeting like the beginning of something. It was also, though none of them could have known it yet, the beginning of an ending that would take decades to arrive, and cost more than any of them would have been willing to pay if the price had been made clear to them at the start. What the 6 men had built in that quiet room was not yet a philosophy. It was an instinct, a shared sense that the world required something that did not yet have a name or a structure, and that they were the people best positioned to provide it. The philosophy came later, assembled gradually from the accumulated weight of individual conviction, from the particular ways that each member had already been living before the group existed. From the experiences and lessons and sometimes the wounds that had shaped each of them into someone who could sit at that table without flinching at what the table implied. To understand what the Illuminati believed and why they believed it with such quiet and durable certainty, it is necessary to understand something about each of the minds that contributed to the collective framework, and about the lives that had made those minds what they were. The concept of protected knowledge is as old as human civilization. Every tradition that has ever taken seriously the project of understanding the world has also grappled with the question of what to do with understanding once it has been achieved, and most of those traditions have arrived, through some combination of wisdom and self-interest, at a similar conclusion, that some knowledge is dangerous in unprepared hands, and that the responsibility of the person who possesses it includes the responsibility to determine who is and is not ready to receive it. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It sits uneasily alongside the democratic impulse that insists on the equal dignity of all people and their equal right to participate in the decisions that govern their lives. But it is a conclusion that experience tends to produce in people who have spent long enough working at the edges of what the world contains, where the things that can be known include things that cannot be unknowed, and where the act of sharing knowledge can cause damage that no subsequent act of care or caution can repair. Dr. Strange had understood this longer and more deeply than perhaps any of his colleagues at the table. The training he had received under the Ancient One was not simply instruction in the mechanics of magical practice. It was initiation into a tradition that had been managing the relationship between hidden knowledge and human welfare for centuries, and that had developed, over those centuries, a sophisticated and sometimes ruthless set of practices for determining what could be taught to whom and when. The mystic arts were not kept secret because their practitioners enjoyed the power that secrecy conferred, though Strange had been honest enough with himself, in his better moments, to acknowledge that power of that kind is never entirely without its appeal. They were kept secret because the alternative, the open and unrestricted dissemination of knowledge about the forces that underlie reality, had been tried in various forms across various periods of history, and the results had consistently been worse than the secrecy they replaced. Strange carried this understanding not as an abstract principle, but as lived experience, as something he had absorbed through years of training and practice, until it had become as natural to him as breathing. The knowledge that the gift of understanding something comes paired with the obligation to be careful about how widely you share it. Charles Xavier's relationship to secrecy was shaped by entirely different forces and carried an entirely different emotional register, but it arrived at a practically similar place. Xavier had spent the better part of his adult life running an institution whose public identity was a school, and whose actual identity was a sanctuary, a training facility, and a covert operations base. All three simultaneously, all three maintained in deliberate concealment from a world that he had concluded could not yet be trusted to respond to the truth with anything other than fear and violence. The decision to hide what he was doing was not made from comfort or from arrogance, or not primarily from those things. It was made from the hard knowledge of what happened when mutants became visible before the people around them were prepared for that visibility. Xavier had seen enough of that to understand it not as a theoretical risk, but as a reliable prediction about human behavior under certain conditions of exposure. He protected his students by protecting their secrets. He maintained the school's concealment because the concealment was the school's first and most fundamental form of defense. By the time he sat down at Tony Stark's table, Xavier had been living this compromise for so long that it had ceased to feel like a compromise at all, and had become simply the condition of responsible action in the world as it actually existed. Namor's relationship to secrecy was the simplest of the 6 members, and perhaps the most honest in its lack of moral elaboration. Atlantis had existed beneath the ocean's surface for thousands of years, and its existence had been, for most of that time, entirely unknown to the civilizations developing on the land masses above. This was not the result of any deliberate policy of concealment so much as the natural consequence of occupying a domain that surface-dwelling humans lack the means to explore. But as the surface world had developed, as its technologies had begun to extend downward into the ocean, in ways that occasionally intersected with Atlantean territory and Atlantean interests, the question of concealment had become deliberate rather than incidental, a policy that the Atlantean state maintained with the same practical intentionality that surface nations brought to their intelligence and diplomatic operations. Namor had grown up understanding that the surface world did not know the full truth of what existed in the waters beneath it, and that this ignorance served Atlantean interests in ways that justified its maintenance. He brought this understanding to the Illuminati not as a moral framework, but as a simple operational reality. The way things worked when you were responsible for protecting something that the world around you did not fully understand and could not be trusted to respond to wisely. Tony Stark's relationship to protected knowledge was more conflicted than Namor's, and more recent in its development than Xavier's, or Strange's, because Tony had spent the early part of his career operating on the assumption that transparency was generally preferable to secrecy, that the free flow of information was a value worth protecting, and that the instinct to hide things was more often a symptom of something problematic than a responsible act of stewardship. His own experience of having his identity as Iron Man kept secret had complicated this assumption, but not fundamentally altered it. What had altered it, slowly and then more decisively, was the accumulation of experiences with threats that operated at a level of complexity and danger that made naive transparency feel less like a virtue and more like a luxury that the world could not afford. The Kree-Skrull War had been the most recent and most compelling of these experiences. It had demonstrated to him, with a clarity that his previous frameworks struggled to accommodate, that there were situations in which the full truth, shared with the full community of interested parties, would produce outcomes worse than the outcomes produced by a smaller group making decisions with more information and less accountability. He had not arrived at this conclusion comfortably, but he had arrived at it, and having arrived, he had committed to its implications with the totality that characterized all of his commitments. Reed Richards occupied a different position from his colleagues in the group's philosophical architecture, one that he himself would have had difficulty articulating cleanly, because the tension that defined his relationship to the Illuminati's operating principles was a tension that lived in the gap between his intellectual conclusions and his emotional commitments. Intellectually, Reed understood the argument for protected knowledge and strategic secrecy, at least as well as anyone in the group, because his scientific training had given him extensive experience with the ways that premature disclosure of incomplete or dangerous findings could cause harm that subsequent correction was unable to fully undo. He had seen this in the laboratory, in his own work and in the work of colleagues, and he had developed from that experience a genuine appreciation for the value of careful, staged communication of difficult information to audiences that needed to be prepared to receive it. But emotionally, Reed was also the person in the group who most deeply valued honesty in his personal relationships, who was most aware of the costs that his tendency toward concealment had extracted from the people closest to him, and who was most uncomfortable with the recognition that the skills he was bringing to the Illuminati's collective project were skills that had sometimes served him badly in his own life. He participated fully, and his participation was genuine and committed, but it carried a quality of internal friction that the other members' participation, by and large, did not. The protocols that the group developed for their collective operation reflected the combined weight of all these different relationships to secrecy. Meetings were held in locations that rotated according to a schedule known only to the members themselves, in spaces that had been checked and prepared by each member's own security resources before the gathering. Communications between meetings were conducted through channels that each member's particular expertise had helped to render as close to undetectable as the available technology and magic could achieve, which was very close indeed given the resources represented at the table. Records of deliberations were not kept in any form that could be recovered by outside parties. The group's existence was not acknowledged even to the closest allies and most trusted colleagues of its individual members. The Avengers did not know, the Fantastic Four's other members did not know, the X-Men did not know. The Inhumans' royal family, beyond Black Bolt himself, did not know. This last point was perhaps the most significant in terms of what it revealed about the group's self-understanding. The decision to conceal their existence not just from the general public or from potential enemies, but from the people who worked most closely alongside each member and who trusted each member most completely, was a decision that went beyond ordinary operational security. It was a decision about the nature of the group's relationship to the wider communities of which each member was a part. It said, implicitly but unmistakably, that the group's activities were not an extension of those communities' collective decision-making processes, not an expression of mandates or priorities established through any form of democratic or consultative procedure, but were instead something that existed entirely outside those processes, accountable to no authority beyond the collective judgment of the 6 people sitting around the table. There was a word for this kind of arrangement, though the members of the group were not generally inclined to apply it to themselves. The word was oligarchy, or something close enough to it that the distinction felt more semantic than substantive. 6 individuals, self-selected on the basis of their own assessment of their exceptional capabilities and responsibilities, making decisions about the welfare of millions of people who had not consented to be governed by those decisions and were not informed that those decisions were being made. The fact that the individuals in question were genuinely exceptional, that their capabilities were genuinely extraordinary, that their intentions were genuinely oriented toward the protection of the world rather than the advancement of their own interests, did not change the structural reality of what they had built. It complicated the moral evaluation of that structure. It did not dissolve the problem at the structure's centre. Dr. Strange, who had thought about these questions longer and from a deeper tradition than his colleagues, was the member most likely to sit with the discomfort of that problem, rather than resolving it through the reassurance of good intentions. The magical tradition's long history included enough examples of well-intentioned concealment producing catastrophic results to prevent him from resting easily in the assumption that wisdom and good purpose were sufficient protections against the failure modes of secrecy. But it also included enough examples of necessary concealment preventing catastrophes that openness would have invited to prevent him from concluding that the discomfort he felt was a signal that the project should be abandoned. The discomfort was, he had come to believe, appropriate. It was the right response to genuinely difficult choices made under genuine uncertainty. The alternative to feeling it was not wisdom. It was the kind of confidence that had historically preceded the most serious failures of judgment in the tradition he served. The contradiction at the heart of the Illuminati's founding philosophy was therefore not hidden from the group's members, at least not entirely. They knew, with varying degrees of explicitness, that they had created something that could not be straightforwardly defended against the values that each of them publicly espoused. They knew that the argument for their existence contained assumptions about their own judgment and their own exceptionalism that required the very humility they were claiming to exercise in order to be applied responsibly. They had decided collectively and with genuine seriousness that these contradictions were the price of the alternative, that a world without the Illuminati's quiet coordination would be more vulnerable, not less, to the kinds of threats that had nearly destroyed it once and would surely attempt to do so again. What none of them had yet fully reckoned with was the question of what would happen if their judgment failed. They had built a system predicated on the reliability of their own wisdom and the sufficiency of their own collective intelligence. They had not, with any comparable thoroughness, built in the mechanisms for recognizing when that wisdom was failing or that intelligence was insufficient. This was not an oversight that any of them would have acknowledged as such, had it been pointed out to them in those early days. It was, instead, the blind spot that tends to form at the center of any sufficiently confident system of thought, the place where the framework's own assumptions prevent it from seeing the limits of the framework. The Illuminati believed they were the people best positioned to know what the world needed. This belief was not unreasonable. It was also the belief that would, in time, cost them and the world they loved more than any of them had imagined possible on the quiet evening when they first sat down together in that simple, unprepossessing room and began to decide the future. The philosophical architecture that the Illuminati had constructed together was, in its first years, largely theoretical. A framework for thinking about the world's dangers and the group's responsibilities, tested occasionally by specific situations that required collective deliberation, but not yet by anything that demanded the kind of consequential, irreversible action that would reveal whether the framework was as sound in practice as it appeared in principle. That test came, as such tests tend to come, not through a gradual escalation that allowed for preparation, but through a sudden confrontation with a reality so extreme in its implications that the group was forced to move from philosophy to decision in a span of time that permitted very little of the careful reflection that their self-understanding as wise and deliberate stewards of the world's safety would have preferred. The Infinity Gems had existed long before any human being knew what they were. They were older than the current universe, remnants of a previous cosmic existence that had ended and been replaced by the reality in which the Illuminati and everyone they cared about lived their lives. Each gem embodied a fundamental aspect of existence with a completeness that made the word embodied feel inadequate, because the gems did not merely represent the forces they were associated with, they were those forces concentrated into physical form in a way that made any object possessing one of them into something qualitatively different from any other object in the universe. The soul gem, the time gem, the space gem, the mind gem, the reality gem, the power gem, together, assembled into the gauntlet that had been designed to hold and channel their combined energy, they constituted something for which ordinary language had no adequate category. A tool capable of rewriting the conditions of existence itself. A weapon against which no defense was conceivable. A responsibility so extreme that its weight, if genuinely felt, would be difficult for even the most stable and well-grounded person to carry without some distortion of judgment. The Illuminati became aware of the full scope of the gems' combined potential through a convergence of their separate areas of expertise, each member contributing a piece of understanding that the other's frameworks could not have generated independently. Strange's magical investigations had long tracked the gems as objects of immense mystical significance, though the tradition's understanding of their nature had been incomplete in ways that Reed's scientific analysis eventually helped to clarify. Reed's theoretical work had approached the gems from the direction of fundamental physics, modelling the forces they represented within frameworks that could accommodate objects that operated outside the normal parameters of matter and energy. Tony's intelligence resources had been tracking the gems' physical locations and the various individuals and organizations that had attempted to possess them over the years. Namor's Atlantean archives contained historical accounts of the gems' effects that predated any surface world record. Xavier's telepathic contacts across the globe had gathered fragments of experiential testimony from people who had encountered the gems at close range. Black Bolt's Inhuman advisors had their own body of accumulated knowledge about objects that resonated with the Terrigen-altered consciousness of their kind. What emerged when these separate bodies of knowledge were brought together into a single conversation was a picture considerably more alarming than any individual member had previously possessed. The gems were not simply powerful objects that needed to be kept away from dangerous people. They were a systemic vulnerability in the architecture of existence itself, a set of keys that, in combination, opened a door that should not exist. The assembled gauntlet had already been used once by Thanos of Titan, with consequences that had reached to the furthest boundaries of the universe and cost more lives than any single event in recorded history. That use had ended. The gauntlet had been dispersed. The gems had been scattered. But scattered was not the same as safe, and the Illuminati, surveying the full landscape of what they collectively knew, arrived at the conclusion that the current state of dispersal offered insufficient protection against the possibility of future assembly by someone willing to do what Thanos had done. The proposal that Tony brought to the group was characteristically direct in its structure and characteristically ambitious in its scope. Rather than leaving the gems where they were, distributed across the universe in the hands of various guardians whose reliability and longevity could not be guaranteed, the Illuminati should gather them, bring all 6 gems under the control of the group. And then, rather than holding them together in a single location where their combined presence would constitute exactly the kind of consolidated vulnerability they were trying to eliminate, distribute them among the group's members for individual safekeeping. 6 gems, 6 guardians, each protecting a single stone within the domain of his particular expertise, and under the security protocols that his specific capabilities allowed. No single member would possess enough of the set to constitute a meaningful threat. No external actor could acquire a complete gauntlet without defeating all 6 members simultaneously, which presented a challenge several orders of magnitude more difficult than defeating any single guardian, however powerful. The deliberation that followed Tony's proposal was longer and more genuinely divided than the group's founding conversation had been. Reed's objections were scientific in their primary register. The act of gathering the gems into proximity with each other, even temporarily, would create interactions between the forces they embodied that were difficult to model and potentially dangerous in ways that were difficult to predict. The very act of collection carried risks. Strange's objections were philosophical as much as practical. The magical tradition's understanding of objects of this kind of power included a long and sobering record of cases in which the act of attempting to control something uncontrollable had itself been the source of the catastrophe that the control was meant to prevent. There was wisdom, Strange suggested, in a humility about the limits of even their collective capacity to manage forces of this magnitude. Xavier's objections were quieter and more interpersonal. He was not certain that he trusted every member of the group, including himself, with the particular kind of temptation that individual custody of an infinity gem would represent over the long term. These objections were real, and they were serious, and they were heard with the attentiveness that the group generally brought to internal disagreement, but they were ultimately insufficient to change the conclusion that the full conversation tended toward, because the alternative they implied, leaving the gems where they were and trusting to the existing arrangements, had already been evaluated and found wanting. The gauntlet had been assembled once. The conditions that had allowed that assembly had not been fundamentally altered by its subsequent dispersal. The probability that someone with the resources and the will of Thanos would eventually attempt to reassemble it was not negligible, and the consequences of that reassembly, as every member of the group understood with the full weight of their combined knowledge, were too extreme to be accepted as a risk that the world's current arrangements were adequate to manage. They agreed. The collection began. The process of locating and acquiring each gem was a month-long undertaking that drew on every resource the group possessed and required a level of coordination more intensive than anything they had previously attempted together. Each gem presented its own specific challenges, residing in a different location under different protective arrangements, requiring a different combination of capabilities to acquire safely. Some were held by individuals or organizations that needed to be approached through negotiation, conducted with enough care to avoid revealing the full scope of what was being assembled. Others were in locations so remote or so hostile that the acquisition required purely physical effort of a kind that tested even the extraordinary capabilities of the group's members. A few were surrounded by circumstances that Strange's magical perception identified as carrying their own subtle dangers, residual effects of previous handling that needed to be neutralized before the gems could be safely moved. Tony coordinated the overall effort with the meticulous project management that was among his most reliable qualities, tracking each acquisition's progress, identifying the interdependencies between different stages of the collection, and adjusting the sequence of operations as circumstances required. Reed provided the scientific analysis that informed the handling protocols for each gem, modelling the interactions that proximity might produce, and designing the containment procedures that would minimize the risks he had identified. Strange provided the magical assessment and the mystical protections that supplemented Reed's scientific precautions. Namor contributed intelligence resources and, in several instances, the direct physical capability to acquire gems from underwater locations that no other member of the group could access with comparable ease. Xavier's telepathic network provided advance information about the intentions and movements of individuals who might complicate the collection effort. Black Bolt's inhuman resources contributed technical capabilities and logistical support that complemented the group's other assets. When the last gem had been secured, and the 6 stones were, for the first time in years, in the same location under controlled conditions, the atmosphere in the room where the group had assembled was not one of triumph. It was something more complicated, a mixture of relief and weight and the particular quality of unease that attaches to the moment when you have achieved something you set out to do, and the achievement confronts you with the full reality of what you now possess. Reed's instruments recorded the interactions between the proximate gems with data that confirmed some of his predicted models and produced anomalies that he filed away for later analysis. Strange could feel the combined presence of the stones in the magical field that his perception extended through the room, and what he felt was not danger, precisely, but a quality of attention, as though the assembled gems were aware of being gathered and were registering the fact in some mode that did not map cleanly onto human categories of consciousness. It was Tony who proposed using the assembled gauntlet before the dispersal. The proposal was not made casually or without awareness of its implications. It was made after extended deliberation, with a specific purpose that the group's intelligence had identified as both achievable and significant. The Beyonder, a being of essentially limitless power, whose relationship to the universe's fundamental structures was as difficult to characterize as the gems themselves, represented an ongoing threat that the group had been tracking for some time. The opportunity to use the Gauntlet's assembled power to expel this being from the universe was, Tony argued, precisely the kind of high-stakes, low-frequency situation that the Gauntlet's acquisition had been intended to address. They had accepted the risks and costs of gathering the gems. Not using them when a genuine use presented itself would make those costs meaningless. The attempt was made. Tony Stark, wearing the assembled Infinity Gauntlet for the first and last time, directed its power toward the task they had identified with the concentration and precision that characterized his best work under pressure. What happened next was instructive in a way that none of them had fully anticipated. The Gauntlet functioned. The power flowed. The Beyonder was affected by the attempt in ways that the group's instruments and Strange's perception could both detect. But the effect was not what the assembled power of all 6 Infinity Gems should, by any theoretical model available to the group, have been capable of producing. The Beyonder was troubled, not defeated, displaced, not expelled, and in the moment when the Gauntlet reached the full extent of what it could achieve against this target, something happened that Reed's instruments recorded and Strange's perception confirmed simultaneously. The gems shattered. Not physically. They remained intact as objects. But something in their combined function, some essential quality of the absolute power they were supposed to embody, was revealed in that moment to be conditional rather than universal. The Infinity Gems, assembled into the complete Gauntlet, were the most powerful objects in their universe. The emphasis, as they now understood, belonged on those last 2 words, their universe. The power they embody was the power of this reality, total within its boundaries, and those boundaries were real. Against a being who existed in some sense outside or between realities, the Gauntlet's power reached its limit, and at that limit, it broke. The silence in the room after this discovery had a quality different from any silence the group had previously shared. It was the silence of people revising their understanding of something they had believed they knew, a process that is never entirely comfortable, even when the revision is in the direction of greater accuracy rather than greater danger. They had acquired the most powerful objects in the universe, and they had discovered that the universe had boundaries they had not fully mapped. The discovery was humbling in the precise sense. It reduced the dimensions of what they believed they could control to something smaller and more honest than what they had assumed. The dispersal that followed was conducted with the same care and methodical attention that the collection had required. Each gem was assigned to the member whose particular domain, capabilities, and existing security infrastructure made him the most suitable long-term guardian. The power gem went to Namor, whose physical and military resources were well suited to protecting an object that expressed the concept of force in its purest form. The space gem went to Professor Xavier, whose telepathic awareness extended across distances that made him a natural custodian for an object associated with the fundamental nature of location and movement. The soul gem went to Doctor Strange, whose magical tradition had the longest and deepest relationship with the dimensions of consciousness and identity that the gem represented. The mind gem went to Tony Stark, whose intelligence and technological resources made him well positioned to protect an object associated with thought and awareness. The reality gem went to Reed Richards, whose scientific understanding of the fabric of existence made him the appropriate guardian for an object that could alter that fabric. The time gem went to Black Bolt, whose inhuman nature and Attilan's isolation provided a combination of protective capabilities suited to an object associated with the most fundamental and irreversible of physical dimensions. Each member left the meeting carrying something that weighed more than its physical mass suggested. The gems were not heavy objects. What was heavy was the knowledge of what they were and what their long-term custody implied, that the men who had gathered them had accepted in a permanent and personal way the responsibility for ensuring that the most dangerous objects in the universe remained out of the hands of anyone who might use them to do what Thanos had done. This responsibility was not a burden that any of them had sought for its own sake. It was the logical conclusion of a process that had begun with the reasonable observation that the gems needed better protection than the existing arrangements provided. The logic was sound. The conclusion followed from the premises, and the weight of it settled onto each of them with the quiet permanence of something that, once accepted, could not be put down. Doctor Strange, making the journey back to the Sanctum Sanctorum with the soul gem secured in protections that had taken him the better part of a week to construct, allowed himself to sit with the full weight of what he was now carrying, not just the gem but everything the day's events had revealed. The Gauntlet's failure against the Beyonder was not a discouragement exactly. It was information. The universe was larger and more complex than even their collective model of it had captured, and the tools they had assembled to protect it had limits that humility required them to hold in clear view. This was not a new lesson for him. It was the oldest lesson his tradition had to teach. But it bore repeating, he had found, with each new iteration of the experience of reaching the edge of what was knowable, and finding that the edge was closer than you had thought. The gems rested in their protections. The day faded toward evening. The world continued, unknowing and unconcerned in the city below. The gems had been distributed. The weight of their custody had settled onto each member's shoulders with the quiet permanence that genuine responsibility tends to carry, and the group had returned to their separate lives and separate domains, carrying something new and heavy and not entirely comfortable in the knowledge of what they now held. But the Illuminati had not been formed to address a single problem, however significant, and the ongoing work of the group continued in the months and years that followed the dispersal, drawing the 6 members together whenever the threat landscape they collectively monitored produced something that warranted their combined attention. Not every meeting addressed a crisis. Some were purely deliberative, surveys of the intelligence each member had gathered since the previous gathering, assessments of the patterns that were emerging from the accumulated data, conversations about whether what they were seeing constituted a threat requiring action, or a situation that could be monitored without intervention. These quieter meetings had their own value, maintaining the channels of communication and the habits of collective thinking that would be needed when the crises came. And the crises, as they always did, came. Among the sustained tensions that ran through the Illuminati's early years, none was more structurally complicated or more personally felt than the questions that Charles Xavier's membership introduced into the group's collective deliberations. The other 5 members each represented in their primary identities a kind of power that was essentially individual. Tony Stark's influence derived from his personal genius and his accumulated resources. Reed Richards' authority rested on his scientific capabilities and his role within the Fantastic Four. Doctor Strange's position as Sorcerer Supreme was by definition singular, a title that belonged to one person at a time and could not be delegated or distributed. Namor and Black Bolt were monarchs, but their kingdoms, however significant, were geographically defined entities whose interests and vulnerabilities were in principle separable from the broader questions of planetary security that the Illuminati existed to address. Xavier was different in kind from all of these, because what Xavier represented was not simply his own exceptional capabilities, but an entire people, a population defined by a shared biological characteristic that made them simultaneously extraordinary and persecuted, and whose collective fate was bound up with decisions made not just by Xavier himself, but by governments, institutions, and social forces that no individual, however intelligent or powerful, could fully direct or predict. This asymmetry had been present from the beginning of Xavier's participation in the group, acknowledged implicitly in the care with which he was approached and the particular quality of his agreement to join. But a symmetry that is acknowledged in principle has a way of producing complications in practice that the acknowledgement did not fully anticipate, because the world does not present its challenges in forms that map cleanly onto the frameworks that have been prepared to receive them. The complications in Xavier's case were not theoretical. They were immediate, ongoing, and deeply personal, rooted in the specific historical moment that the mutant community was living through, and in the specific choices that Xavier had made, over the course of decades, about how to navigate the impossible terrain between a world that feared mutants and a mutant community that needed both protection and the freedom to be fully what it was. The relationship between mutants and the broader superhero community had never been simple. There was a structural irony embedded in the situation that Xavier had long since made his peace with, or learned to live with, which is not quite the same thing. The heroes whose adventures filled the newspapers and whose exploits generated public admiration were celebrated precisely for the extraordinary capabilities that distinguished them from ordinary people. The mutants whose existence generated fear and legislative hostility were reviled for possessing extraordinary capabilities that had arrived through a different mechanism and carried a different cultural meaning. The distinction was not rational, and Xavier had never expected it to be. Human responses to difference operate on registers that have very little to do with rational analysis. And the fact that a radioactive spider bite was culturally legible as heroic origin, while an X gene was culturally legible as threat, said nothing about the relative merits of the abilities produced in each case, and a great deal about the stories that different communities tell about themselves and about the things they fear. What Xavier had built in response to this situation was remarkable in ways that his colleagues at the Illuminati table understood imperfectly, because understanding it fully required inhabiting a position that none of them occupied. The Xavier Institute was simultaneously a school, a sanctuary, a training ground, a political statement, and a long-term bet on the possibility of a future in which the fear currently directed at mutants would be replaced by something better. Every choice Xavier made in running the institution, from the curriculum he designed to the missions he sanctioned to the public statements he made and withheld, was shaped by the awareness that he was not making choices for himself alone, but for every student who had come to him for protection, and every mutant who had not yet found their way to his door. The weight of this was different from the weight that his Illuminati colleagues carried, not necessarily heavier in an absolute sense, but heavier in a particular way, because it included the weight of other people's vulnerability in a form that was direct and immediate and impossible to intellectualize away. The Illuminati's discussions of mutant-related crises had a quality that differed from their discussions of other threats, a quality that was partly the result of Xavier's presence at the table, and partly the result of the way the other members related to mutant issues when Xavier was not in the room. Tony Stark's relationship to the mutant question was complicated by his own position as someone whose identity as a powered individual depended on technology rather than biology, which gave him a theoretical sympathy with the argument for mutant rights, while also allowing him a degree of distance from its urgency that Xavier could feel even when Tony was at his most supportive. Reed Richards engaged with the question primarily through a scientific lens, treating the X gene as a fascinating evolutionary phenomenon and the social responses to it as a problem susceptible to rational analysis, an approach that was not wrong exactly, but that missed dimensions of the situation that could only be perceived from inside the experience of being feared for something you were born with. Namor's relationship to the mutant community was its own particular complexity, because Namor was himself a mutant, the first of his kind in the public record. And his response to this fact had always been more defiant than protective, more invested in his own exceptionalism than in the collective situation of people who shared his biological category. There were specific moments when the structural tension between Xavier's dual loyalties became not merely a background condition, but an immediate practical problem that required navigation careful enough to test even his considerable diplomatic and psychological resources. These were the moments when the Illuminati's collective assessment of a mutant-related situation diverged from Xavier's own assessment, when the group's cost-benefit analysis produced a conclusion that Xavier could see the logic of and simultaneously could not accept without betraying something essential about what he had spent his life trying to protect. The group's resources and collective intelligence were occasionally brought to bear on mutant-related situations in ways that intersected with what the X-Men were doing, and the question of how much Xavier should share with his colleagues about his other community's activities, and how much of the Illuminati's deliberations he should carry back into his work with the X-Men, was a question that had no clean answer, and that he navigated with a mixture of judgment and discomfort that he carried largely alone. The discomfort was not simply strategic, it was personal in a way that cut to the centre of Xavier's understanding of himself. He had built his life on the belief that honesty, pursued with sufficient patience and intelligence and faith in the possibility of genuine communication between different kinds of people, could produce understanding that transformed fear into acceptance. The Illuminati's operating model asked him to maintain a form of strategic dishonesty with the people who trusted him most, both his X-Men colleagues who did not know about the group and the Illuminati colleagues who did not have full access to his thinking about how the group's activities affected the mutant community he represented. He managed this because the alternative of not managing it was worse, because the genuine goods that the Illuminati produced justified the compromises their operation required, because he had been making comparable compromises in various forms since long before the group existed. But managing it was not the same as resolving it, and the tension between his commitments did not diminish with time or with the accumulation of evidence that the group was doing genuinely important work. What the other members understood about Xavier's situation, and what they did not understand, shaped the group's collective blind spots in ways that would only become fully apparent much later. Tony Stark understood that Xavier carried obligations that complicated his participation in the group, and he respected those obligations in the abstract while remaining impatient with them in specific instances where they slowed or complicated collective decision-making. Reed Richards understood the theoretical complexity of Xavier's position more completely than he understood its emotional weight, which was the characteristic form that Reed's partial comprehension of other people's realities tended to take. Strange understood something that the others perhaps did not, which was that the kind of dual loyalty Xavier maintained was not simply a practical problem to be managed, but a spiritual condition that extracted costs from the person who bore it. Costs that did not show up in any balance sheet or decision tree, but that accumulated in ways that eventually changed the person carrying them. There was a particular meeting, in the years that the Illuminati was finding its operational rhythms, that illustrated the nature of the tension more clearly than most. A mutant-related crisis had developed in circumstances that brought it into the direct operational territory of both the X-Men and the wider superhero community. Creating a situation where the Illuminati's resources and intelligence could contribute to a resolution, but where Xavier's full participation in the group's deliberations would require him to share information about X-Men activities and vulnerabilities that he had not cleared with his other colleagues. The group's discussion proceeded with the partial information that Xavier provided, his choices about what to share shaped by judgments that he could articulate only in the most general terms without revealing what he was withholding and why. The resolution they reached was adequate. It was not as good as it might have been with fuller information. Xavier knew this, and the knowledge settled onto him with the particular weight of a cost that could not be shared or explained. Tony noticed the incompleteness, because Tony noticed most things, and filed it for later consideration with the efficiency that characterized his information management. He did not raise it directly at the time, partly out of respect for Xavier's judgment, and partly because the resolution had been adequate enough that pressing the point felt more like an assertion of principle than a practical necessity. But the observation remained, a small accumulation in the ledger of the group's internal dynamics, another data point in the ongoing assessment that each member was always implicitly conducting of his colleagues' full reliability as partners in the group's collective project. The strain that Xavier's dual loyalty placed on his participation grew rather than diminished as the years passed, and the mutant community's situation became more, not less, urgent. The world's response to mutants had its periods of relative openness and its periods of severe contraction, and the Illuminati's years coincided with several of the contractions, periods when legislative hostility and public fear generated pressures on the mutant community that required Xavier's full attention and energy, and that made his participation in the group's activities feel, at times, like a diversion from the more immediate and personal emergency developing in his other life. Dr. Strange watched this process with the attentiveness that he brought to everything that touched on the cost of power and the burdens of exceptional responsibility. He had spent enough of his own life carrying things that could not be shared or explained to recognize the specific quality of exhaustion that Xavier's situation produced, the way it settled into the eyes, and the posture, and the particular quality of silence that a person maintains when they are holding something too heavy to put down and too complicated to describe. He said very little about what he observed, because Strange had learned that the most useful response to observing someone else's private struggle is rarely to name it aloud. But he held what he saw with a careful compassion, and it informed his understanding of the group's dynamics in ways that would matter, eventually, when the dynamics produced their most serious consequences. What the Illuminati's engagement with the mutant question ultimately revealed was something that the group had been circling since its founding without quite arriving at directly, that the problems they were trying to address were not cleanly separable from the social and political realities in which they were embedded, and that a group of 6 individuals, however extraordinary, could not substitute their collective judgment for the messy, imperfect, irreplaceable processes through which communities work out what they believe and what they are willing to do. Xavier had built his life on those processes, on the slow, patient work of changing minds and building understanding, and he brought that knowledge to the Illuminati table as surely as Strange brought magical awareness and Reed brought scientific precision. The group was richer for his presence. It was also in ways that took time to become fully visible, altered by the contradictions his presence embodied, changed in ways that no one had entirely anticipated when the invitation had first been extended, and quietly, carefully, and with complete sincerity accepted. The tensions that Xavier's presence introduced into the group's collective life were, in their deepest form, tensions about the limits of what any small group of individuals could responsibly decide on behalf of people who had not consented to be governed by their decisions. Tony Stark had been thinking about this problem for a long time before he brought it to the Illuminati. His thinking had the character that his most serious analytical work tended to have: thorough, unsentimental in its engagement with the data, and arriving at conclusions that his emotional responses found difficult to accept, and his rational framework found difficult to avoid. The data said that the current management approach was not a solution. It was a continuous expenditure of resources and attention, and hope that the next episode would be manageable, in service of a situation that showed no trajectory toward resolution. The data also said that Bruce, whatever his personal qualities and genuine heroic contributions, had in his Hulk form caused harm at a scale that, if perpetrated by any other agent, would have resulted in permanent containment without the extended patience that Bruce's relationships with other heroes had generated. The gap between how the situation was being handled and how it would be handled if Bruce were not Bruce was, Tony had concluded, a gap that sentiment was maintaining in the face of a risk assessment that did not support it. A planet had been identified. The Illuminati's collective resources, which by this point included intelligence networks that extended well beyond Earth's atmosphere, had located a world whose characteristics seemed, on the available evidence, genuinely suited to the purpose. A world with a breathable atmosphere and a compatible biology, with a population sparse enough and hardy enough that the Hulk's presence would not constitute the existential threat it constituted on Earth, with conditions challenging enough to engage the Hulk's strength and resilience, without providing the specific kind of human social provocation that most reliably produced Bruce's most destructive responses. It was not a prison. Tony made this point with an emphasis that revealed his awareness of how easily the distinction could collapse. It was, in his framing, a home, a different home, a more appropriate home, for someone whose needs and whose nature had never quite fit the world he had been born into. Reed Richards was the first to object, and his objection was both the most intellectually rigorous and the most personally revealing contribution to the deliberation that followed. Reed understood, with the precision that characterized his engagement with any problem he took seriously, exactly what the proposal was doing at a structural level, and he articulated that understanding with a directness that temporarily silenced the room. They were proposing, he said, to make a permanent life-altering decision on behalf of a person who had not consented to it, based on their assessment of what was best for him and for the world, using means that bypassed any legal or ethical framework that would normally govern a decision of this magnitude. The framing as relocation rather than exile was a semantic choice, not a moral one. Bruce would be deceived into boarding a vessel. He would be transported against his will to a location he had not chosen. He would not be given the opportunity to refuse. These were the facts of the proposal, and the facts needed to be named clearly before any decision was made. Deliberation lasted through 2 full meetings and extended into written exchanges between sessions that were among the most substantive the group had produced. Each member's position evolved through the process, not dramatically, but in the ways that genuine engagement with other people's thinking tends to produce, small adjustments of emphasis and qualification that accumulated into something meaningfully different from where each person had begun. Reed's objections remained the most sustained and the most structurally rigorous, but they modulated from outright opposition toward a position of deeply reluctant acceptance conditioned on specific commitments about the planet's suitability and the quality of care taken in Bruce's preparation and transport. Xavier never became comfortable with the proposal, but his position shifted from active resistance toward a grieving acquiescence that he could not entirely justify to himself, and that he accepted because the alternative, his withdrawal from the group's collective decision, felt like an abdication that would leave the decision in worse hands than his continued participation allowed. Strange's evolution was perhaps the most complex, moving through a phase of genuine uncertainty about whether the magical tradition's understanding of consequences and costs offered any clear guidance for a situation this novel, toward a conclusion that the proposal was defensible under the specific conditions that Reed had outlined, and that Strange himself supplemented with requirements about the protections to be placed on the shuttle and the honesty of the communication that would precede Bruce's boarding. The execution of the plan fell primarily to Tony, who handled the practical mechanics with the efficiency that his particular capabilities enabled, and with an emotional self-management that his colleagues could observe but not fully interpret. The conversation with Bruce, in which the deception was delivered, was one that Tony conducted alone, and that he did not describe in detail in the group's subsequent communications. What could be observed from the outside was that the conversation had occurred, that Bruce had boarded the shuttle, and that the shuttle had departed on the trajectory that the group's planning had established. What could not be observed from the outside was what Tony carried away from that conversation, what it cost him to look at a man he had fought alongside and considered, in some complicated sense, a colleague, and to tell him something that was not the truth about what was happening to him. Tony was the first to face him, because Tony had been the architect of the plan and the executor of its deception, and because the Hulk's understanding of accountability began where the chain of causation was most directly traceable. The battle that occurred between Iron Man and the Hulk in those first hours of the return was not the kind of battle that their previous encounters had produced, that contained engagements between a hero attempting to minimize damage and a transformed man responding to immediate provocation. It was something closer to a reckoning, one party bringing the full range of his technological capability to bear with a focused desperation that acknowledged the stakes, the other bringing a strength and purpose that Iron Man's armor had never previously been required to fully absorb. Tony survived. He survived because his engineering was excellent, and because he was fighting with the particular quality of effort that comes from knowing that you are responsible for the situation you're in, that the force being directed at you has a legitimate source, and that the only morally available response is to endure it without retreat. He did not win. The concept of winning did not apply to what that confrontation was. The ethical dimensions of this possibility were not simple, and the Illuminati's discussion of them was not brief. The proposal being considered was, in its essential structure, a global act of non-consensual memory alteration performed on every human being on Earth simultaneously. The scale alone placed it in a category of intervention that the group had never previously contemplated, because the previous decisions that had generated the most serious ethical objections had been decisions affecting single individuals or specific communities, decisions whose scope, however significant, could be measured in human terms that made the moral accounting tractable. This was different in kind. This was the Illuminati proposing to reach into the minds of every person on Earth and remove something from them without asking whether they wished to have it removed, without their knowledge that the removal was occurring, and without any mechanism for consent or objection or subsequent appeal. He agreed, in the end, as the group had concluded he would, because the alternative was not better, and because Strange's understanding of his own responsibilities had never allowed him the comfort of refusing to act when action was available, and inaction produced worse outcomes. But his agreement was accompanied by conditions and commitments that he stated with a precision that reflected the seriousness with which he had weighed what he was about to do. The spell would be specific in its scope. It would address only the knowledge of Peter's identity and nothing else. It would be constructed with every protection his craft could provide against unintended effects, and he would bear the knowledge of what he had done, without diminishment or self-justification, as part of the ongoing accounting that his practice required him to maintain with himself about the uses to which his capabilities had been put. The spell was cast. The knowledge of Peter Parker's identity as Spider-Man was removed from the awareness of everyone who had possessed it. Aunt May recovered, in the altered timeline that the broader magical intervention eventually produced, in ways that the medical prognosis had not supported. Peter's two identities were separated again, the mask restored to its function, the press conference unmade in the awareness of everyone who had watched it. The world moved forward into a configuration that the Illuminati's intervention had shaped, as the world had been shaped by their previous interventions, without knowing that the shaping had occurred or who had performed it, or what it had cost. The pattern that Dr. Strange had named to himself in the quiet aftermath of the memory spell did not dissolve simply because it had been named. Patterns of this kind rarely do. They persist because the conditions that generated them persist, because the people embedded within them continue to make the choices that the pattern's logic tends to produce, and because the alternative to making those choices, the alternative of stepping outside the pattern entirely and refusing its premises, requires a clarity and a courage of a specific kind that is genuinely difficult to sustain when the immediate situation always presents itself as urgent enough to justify one more iteration of the familiar response. The Illuminati continued, the meetings continued, the secure communications and the carefully maintained protocols of secrecy continued, and the world continued to present them with situations that seemed, each time, to require exactly the kind of response that only a group like theirs was positioned to provide. Had demonstrated their combined capabilities in terms calculated to make the cost of another invasion sufficiently vivid that the Skrull leadership would conclude the attempt was not worth the outcome, and had departed with what they assessed as a reasonable expectation that the demonstration had achieved its intended effect. What they had not fully accounted for was the possibility that the demonstration would achieve an effect they had not intended, that the Skrulls would study the information gathered during the mission, not as a deterrent but as a blueprint, analysing the capabilities they had been shown in order to develop methods for circumventing them, and analysing the individuals who had delivered the warning in order to understand them well enough to replace them. The capture and examination of Skrull technology and biological samples during the subsequent years had produced, in Skrull laboratories, something that the Illuminati's threat assessments had treated as theoretically possible but practically unlikely, a method for creating Skrull infiltrators whose physical and biological mimicry of their human targets was accurate enough to defeat the detection methods that the most capable humans on Earth would think to apply. Telepathic scanning, which Xavier's presence in the group had made available as a detection tool, and which had always been one of the Illuminati's most reliable means of verifying the authenticity of individuals in sensitive situations, could not distinguish a sufficiently advanced Skrull duplicate from the genuine article. Technological scanning, which Tony's resources enabled at a level beyond what any other human organization could achieve, was similarly insufficient against the most sophisticated versions of the Skrull biological engineering that the intelligence gathering from the Illuminati's own mission had helped to inform. The group had visited the Skrull homeworld to warn them. They had instead provided them with the specific information needed to make the invasion that the warning was designed to prevent effectively undetectable. The implications of this disclosure spread outward from the specific revelation in waves that each member of the group processed according to his particular psychological architecture. Tony's response was immediate and systematic, a rapid reassessment of every decision the group had made during the period when the impersonator had been present, every piece of intelligence that had been shared at those meetings, every conclusion that the impersonator's participation had influenced, catalogued with the efficiency of someone who understands that the damage assessment must precede the damage response, and that pausing to feel things is a luxury that the timeline does not currently support. Reed's response was more conflicted, because Reed's scientific training made him want to understand before he acted, to establish the full parameters of what had happened before attempting to address what it meant. But the parameters in this case kept expanding as his analysis proceeded, because the question of how long the replacement had been in place was a question with implications that grew more serious the further back the honest answer extended. Strange's response was the one that most clearly reflected the weight of the specific failure involved, because Strange's tradition had maintained for centuries that the first protection against infiltration and deception was the quality of attention brought to what was directly in front of you, and the Illuminati had been bringing what they believed was considerable quality of attention to their meetings for years without detecting a Skrull sitting at their table. Xavier's absence from the most acute phase of the crisis's resolution reflected the degree to which his own situation had deteriorated in ways that the group had been perceiving in fragments for some time without assembling into the complete picture that the crisis now forced into clarity. The pressures that had been accumulating in Xavier's life, the mutant community's increasingly dire circumstances, the specific traumas of the preceding years, the sustained cost of the dual loyalty that his Illuminati membership had required him to maintain, had produced a deterioration in his condition and his judgment that his colleagues had been reluctant to name directly, partly out of respect for him, and partly out of the particular reluctance that people who are themselves carrying heavy loads feel toward acknowledging the weight that someone they care about is carrying. The Xavier, who might have brought his telepathic capabilities to bear on the infiltration problem with the full force of his abilities, was not available in the way that the group's planning had assumed he would be, and the gap this created in the collective response was one that could not be straightforwardly filled. Tony Stark's period of maximum personal consequence during and after the invasion, which saw him carrying the burden of a specific and terrible responsibility for intelligence failures whose direct costs were measured in the lives and suffering of people he had believed he was protecting, was in many ways the most public expression of what the group as a whole was experiencing in less visible ways. His position in the post-invasion period, characterized by a degree of public accountability that the Illuminati's other members did not face in comparable form, required him to absorb consequences that the group's collective decision-making had helped to produce in a context where the group's existence could not be acknowledged, and its role in the situation could not be explained. He carried this alone, in the specific sense that the accountability was individual, even though the decisions had been collective, and the experience of this asymmetry added a dimension to his understanding of what the Illuminati's secrecy cost that he had not previously fully inhabited. Strange spent the post-invasion period in a form of sustained self-examination that was not quite penance and not quite analysis, but something between them, a careful review of the assumptions he had brought to the group's security posture and the ways that those assumptions had reflected not just reasonable assessments of available information, but also something more like wishful thinking, the desire of someone who has invested heavily in a system to believe that the system's protections are more reliable than the evidence fully supports. His tradition had warnings about this too, about the specific blindness that comes from wanting something to be true, and allowing that wanting to shape the interpretation of evidence that does not fully support it. He had known these warnings. He had not entirely heeded them. The knowing and the heeding were, as he had been reminded repeatedly throughout the Illuminati's history, different operations that did not automatically follow from each other. Namor's continued participation in the reformed group was itself a statement about the nature of the Illuminati's reconstituted purpose, because Namor had never been the member whose presence most easily evoked the kind of idealistic self-justification that the group sometimes slipped into when its members were at their most comfortable with their own assessment of their collective virtue. He was there because his capabilities were genuinely valuable, and because his access to resources and intelligence that the other members could not replicate made the group more effective with his participation than without it. And these were the reasons he was there rather than any strong alignment between his values and the group's stated principles. The directness of this was, in its own way, useful. A group that includes someone who is present for purely pragmatic reasons, and who makes no particular effort to conceal this fact, is a group that is somewhat protected against the specific self-deception of believing that the alignment of individual values and collective purpose is more complete than it actually is. The practical work of the reformed Illuminati in its early post-invasion period was less dramatic than the work of the preceding years had been, which was partly a reflection of the particular moment in the threat landscape, and partly a reflection of the group's deliberate effort to pull back from the kind of large-scale, consequence-heavy interventions that had defined its most problematic episodes. There was a quality of consolidation to this period, of attending to the maintenance and refinement of the intelligence and communication infrastructure that the group's more spectacular failures had sometimes caused to be neglected in favour of immediate crisis response. The meetings were quieter, the deliberations produced more incremental conclusions. The sense that the group was managing a situation rather than shaping it was both a source of some relief and a source of some frustration, depending on which member was being consulted and at what point in the period under consideration. Reed's anomaly readings continued to accumulate, filed in the careful archives that his scientific practice maintained and revisited periodically against the frameworks that his theoretical work was developing for understanding what they might represent. The accumulation was gradual enough that no single addition to the record triggered the threshold of urgency that would have elevated the anomalies from background monitoring to active investigation. But the pattern that was emerging from the accumulated data, if the data had been viewed from a sufficient distance, and with a sufficient willingness to follow the implications of its shape wherever they led, was a pattern that pointed towards something far larger than any threat the Illuminati had previously addressed. is something that the group was not yet in a position to fully see, and that the world was not yet in a position to understand they needed to be protected from. The world outside the Illuminati's awareness continued in the ordinary motion of a world that does not know what is being monitored on its behalf, and the group continued in the careful, somewhat diminished, considerably more cautious operation that its reformed configuration had produced. They were wiser than they had been, in the specific ways that surviving serious failure tends to produce wisdom in people who are honest enough to let the failure teach them what it has to teach. They were also still themselves, still carrying the specific combinations of exceptional capability and characteristic limitation that had produced both their genuine contributions to the world's welfare and their most consequential errors. The instruments continued to register their anomalies. The magical perception continued its quiet vigilance. And somewhere in the architecture of the universe, at a level of abstraction that the group's best analytical tools had not yet resolved into something they could fully describe, something was changing, had been changing for some time, and was moving toward the specific form that it would eventually take when the Illuminati finally understood what they had been looking at, which was the beginning of the end of everything they had been formed to protect. What remains, when the details have softened and the names have grown quiet, is something simpler than any of it. The image of people who cared enough to try, who kept trying even when the trying produced outcomes they had not wanted, who carried the weight of their own limitations alongside the weight of their responsibilities, and continued forward anyway, because continuing forward was what the love required. Let that image rest with you now, in the gentle dark, as the story releases its hold, and the mind grows softer, and the breath slows to its own quiet rhythm. You have travelled far tonight. Rest now. Let everything you carried here dissolve into the simple, sufficient peace of this moment, and sleep.